Hello, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. Where better to spend a sunny spring evening than 30 feet underground in an old meat cellar. Welcome to tonight's panel discussion on sustaining grassroots nightlife, organised by KINDRED and the London Museum and hosted here at Fabric. Before we start, can I remind everyone just to please put your phones on silent if they're not already. There are no fire drills planned tonight. So if an alarm goes off, please make your way calmly to the nearest exit. Great. I am thrilled to introduce a fantastic panel tonight. People working at the cutting edge of London's nightlife. We are joined by Anjali Prashaswar, a writer, DJ, and party organizer. She released her first book, Club Commons, Moving Bodies to Grow Movements in Queer Nightlife and Beyond, earlier this year. It is an absolutely fantastic book, and I would urge you all to check it out. Lenny Watson is a co-founding director of Sister Midnight, a community co-op based in Catford, South London, who are opening a music venue later this year. Lenny also works as a cooperative practitioner and community asset developer, supporting others to utilize legal structures, fundraising methods, and ways of working that empower communities to play an active role in the ownership of their local infrastructure. And over on my left is Mike Levitt, the founder of Ormside Projects, a DIY arts and nightlife space supporting experimental music and grassroots creative communities. Please give them all a big hand. So conversations about the politics of nightlife can often feel a little technical, get bogged down in the minutiae of legislation, planning, knotty questions around money, power, property, and physical space. So I wanted to try and reconnect the beginning of this conversation with something more human, something more emotive. The emotive power of the dance floor, I'm sure, is something that we've all experienced at one time or another. So I wanted to ask each of our panelists, what's one meaningful moment from your own clubbing experiences which either inspired you to do what you do now or captured a feeling that means something special to you? Anjali, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Can you hear me through this? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here tonight, and also Ed for facilitating. A kind of meaningful and memorable dance floor experience for me is definitely one of my first nights working at a club quite a few years ago. It was a warehouse space in East London that's now been torn down because the area's been redeveloped, so big boo. But it was Inferno. Does anyone know Inferno? A few nods. Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know Inferno, it's like a queer techno performance art night. And so, yeah, one of my first nights working through the whole night, I was still getting the lay of the land. It's a very like chaotic, hectic environment, just like finding my feet. And they always have incredible performances. And one of the performances that night was like in the middle of the dance floor, and the performer was in like a paddling pool full of water. And it was amazing, splashed around. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was very messy. And then me and a few other of the people working were like, we'll do the sensible thing. And when the performance is done, we're going to carry the paddling pool out to the yard to drain it for safety so that people don't like slip on it. Anyways, that didn't go well. The paddling pool burst in the middle of the dance floor. And then all I can remember is the strobe light going on and me and like two other people trying to shovel water out of the venue. And it was like incredibly disorientating. Really, like literally couldn't see what we were doing, just like splashing around in the middle. Anyways, all these like fabulous queer, like techno gorgeous peoples just like ended up like stomping through all the water thinking it was like an intentional dance floor feature. It was a very good introduction, I think, to what working in a club would be like. So yeah, that's the one, like meaningful, memorable. I don't know where that story draws the line with that one, but it definitely stays in my mind for a while.
Meaningful, memorable, and moist.
Yes, exactly. Yes, thank you.
Lenny, how about you?
God, I don't know if mine's going to top that, to be honest. I think for me, it's probably like one of the first few times that I went out to Bussy in Peckham. There was like a specific night where me and a couple of my like new friends at uni were just out at the pub, and it was that time where cost of living and the cost of getting into a club was cheap enough that you could just do it on a whim. And we just kind of thought, yeah, let's just go to Bussy and check out what's on there, and rocked up and just had the most beautiful time dancing together. And it was just like such a warm feeling. And I think I had so many nights at Bussy, Soul Train especially, where it was just like the feeling of community there was something that was like still very new to me as like an 18-year-old who's quite fresh to going out. And I think that really introduced me into like just how joyful it can be to be on a dance floor, and really like switch me on to like the power that those spaces have.
Amazing, thank you. And Mike, yours.
Hey, so I found this question super hard to even like think about, because I feel so many things just kind of blur into different moments and remembering different elements and architectures and details around things. But so I think I'll just maybe say about one experience, which was first moving to London, and this would have been 2005, and having like been listening to like a lot of dubstep that summer, and this kind of new kind of sound coming out, and then going to this small club where for me it was like experiencing it for the first time in a space that and the sort of immersion of that, and just the sort of darkness of the club, the sort of the smallness of it. And of course this was like pre-smoking ban as well, so like the smell as well of like the whole place stunk of weed, you know. It's like, and yeah, I think that's sort of a memorable moment to share.
A true meditation on bass weight.
Exactly.
I realised that I haven't introduced myself. I'm Ed Gillett. I'm a journalist and author. And my memory, I had a couple of options for this. I vividly remember going to All Tomorrow's parties and seeing Omar S play the final DJ set of the weekend. And it is, you know, that tension that happens at the end of a set when the lights come up and everyone's sort of wanting to carry on. It's the only time that's actually happened. I'm not sure how or why, but Omar S managed to convince Butlin's security to let him carry on playing for another 45 minutes with the house lights on full. And it really showed me that these spaces are things that we have to fight for. And if you win, the prizes can be substantial and joyous. Moving on to perhaps more detailed questions about the politics and economics and mechanics of nightlife. I wanted to begin by asking about the sort of prevailing narrative around nightlife in London in particular, but in the UK as a whole, that we are in the middle of a crisis, particularly facing grassroots music venues. What do you think is the most commonly misunderstood or overstated aspect of this? How do we talk honestly about the risks that venues face without catastrophizing? Mike, maybe would you start us off?
So I guess like an important thing to think about is we're talking about an ecosystem, so it's every element of it, and how these elements need to be balanced for things to thrive. And so I guess when we talk about like crisis, I think it's more just shifts in how that ecosystem works really. And if there's so many elements that kind of can change within that, but I think it's then the sort of job of the community and spaces to kind of then just adapt to those different changes, I guess. Was there something in terms of like a very specific thing? I don't know if we want to talk about that now. Or...
Yeah, I mean, feel free to.
I mean, one thing, for example, might be in terms of like risk factor, for example, and the points in which a venue's like like a grassroots promoter or for example, their break-even point in relation to like the artist they're paying, the venue they're renting, the model in which that kind of fits in, is so slim, and it's like, yeah, where those kind of risks fall, and essentially trying to mitigate risk and share risk within the whole ecosystem rather than having it all fall, or it largely fall in certain places, I think is a key thing.
Thanks. Yeah, not having one point of failure. Lenny, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think that the crisis is very real. I don't think that we should shy away from that, but I also think that what we're not doing perhaps quite a good enough job of is sharing all the incredible stories of like amazing venues up and down the country that are prevailing in the face of that, and new things that are opening up. And like that feels kind of miraculous at a time like this when it is so hard for venues to survive. So like I don't think that we need to stop talking about the very real crisis that is happening, but we should also be celebrating some of the wins that are coming out of grassroots work.
Yeah, I feel like 2025, I don't know if anyone else felt this, was the first year in a very long time where it felt like there were as many exciting venue openings as tragic closures. Angeli, we've spoken about this very issue before. I'm sure you've got lots to add as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I would agree with you in that like there are so many challenges that I'm sure we're all of us in this room are aware of in terms of like what people in the grassroots, nightlife sector face. And that is really important to talk about. That's really important to bring light to. But often I find in these prevailing discussions, I do also find a lot of like worker voices missing and worker stories missing in these dominant narratives. Whenever a venue shuts, it's like a whole lot of people who lose out on jobs. And when I say workers, I'm not just talking about venue operators or DJs or promoters. I'm also talking about like bar staff and cleaners and security and welfare workers. And often, it's these people who are sustaining these spaces, these people who are really bringing them to light kind of behind the scene. And I do think that their voices kind of get lost in a lot of these discussions. And I think that they have a real acute understanding of the challenges that grassroots nightlife is facing. So I think, yeah, when we talk about the crisis, when we talk about these challenges, I think I'd also like to see a lot of inclusion, more inclusion of the kind of like breadth of all of the different roles that happen in nightlife.
Mike, you mentioned a point about risk earlier, and I just wanted to maybe tie that into some of the stuff we're discussing here. What are the practical day-to-day steps that venues and operators can take to mitigate some of those risks? And what are things that we as fans, as dancers, as music lovers can do to make it easier for venues and operators to make the sums that add up?
So I guess there's, from a venue side, like traditionally, thinking back to maybe some of the first times I would have played in some venues, like there was no rent for the venue and I was paid a percentage of the bar. Like I can't think of anywhere that operates that would, what we'd call a club now or a music venue, operate with that model. And I think that just shows the shifting thing in drink sales being the predominant factor. In terms of, and also the fact that a lot of venues have, if they're getting an external promoter in, they'll set a bar minimum. And, this is like, that really emphasizes this is the primary source of income for these spaces. And I think that, like, just look at like alcohol industries like across the world right now, like alcohol is a declining like business, and shifting away from that and actually is, it's really key, I think.
Yeah, supporting versions of nightlife that are not rooted in alcohol sales. Exactly.
And really, the way in which the landscape has changed and why people go to venues and what these sort of, what drives people there has changed as well. And then becoming much more focused on very specific things like the music itself rather than anything else. So yeah, I don't know, like in terms of, sorry, what was the actual?
It was about how people can help mitigate risk.
So in terms of mitigating risk, from an audience perspective, there's quite a lot of different things. For example, like pre-buying tickets gives this is like a big factor, which is the amount of tickets that are pre-sold versus on the door. Like a lot of nights used to run where you had no idea how many people were going to come until the doors opened, and then at the end of the night you counted the money kind of situation versus like the money being able to come in. So I don't know, like I haven't got
No, that's that you've covered a lot of that really excellently. Lenny, obviously you are about to open a new venue. How do you hope that your community and customers will help you keep it afloat? What would you ideally like to see them doing when they come through the doors?
I think that what you've touched on about like the business model of venues being so rooted in alcohol is such a big problem for us. Like younger people are drinking less, as you say, alcohol sales are declining. That feels like a really kind of scary time because it is the source of income for venues. And I feel like we always want to try and be transparent with people about how much that matters, and not in a way to like pressure people to drink, but just to say like, actually everyone rocking up early and having their first drink in the venue and watching the sport bands, as opposed to going down to the pub down the road, makes such a difference to us. But like, it's so frustrating that the ways that we have to mitigate these risks are like rooted in that and encouraging people to come and drink, to trying to take trade away from like other places, because we all exist in this ecosystem as you've described. And like one of the things that we have been trying to do through our model, which is like a community-owned not-for-profit model, is to make ourselves more eligible for different types of funding support. So grants, but also being able to generate money through selling shares in our co-op and people becoming members. And that is like how we've raised most of the money to open our venue. But that also relies on like money being available from grant funders. And those sources of income are like also drying up at a really alarming rate. So I feel like we're getting closer and closer to a point where like the whole model of how the industry is working, how grassroots venues are running, is going to have to shift a lot. And I think there's some really good work being done around this. Like Music Venue Trust have been campaigning for a really long time for the grassroots levy, where shows at stadiums and arenas have like £1 added to each ticket, and that goes into a pot that gets redistributed at grassroots level. And things like that are just so important because there is so much money in this industry, but at the grassroots, we're just not seeing it. And it is like a really, really fragile balance right now. So I think that change kind of needs to come top down. I think venues are doing as much as we all can to mitigate risks, and audience members are doing as much as they can to show up and be part of those spaces. But money's tight for everyone, and we just need more to come down from the top.
Agreed. Anjali, your views?
Yeah, I would really, the kind of like wealth redistribution model from Music Venue Trust is, I think one of the most incredible things that I've heard of lately, and it's really exciting. And also just kind of what you also said about like buying tickets in advance. Also as like a promoter, I've had a couple friends over the past few weeks actually that have had to cancel their nights a week or 2 weeks out. And, you know, there's nothing to say they might have sold enough tickets on the day, but often with grassroots promoters, they're shouldering a huge financial risk that they just can't take if they haven't sold enough tickets a couple days before. So yeah, that's quite a big one. But also I just wanted to also talk about kind of in terms of like mitigating risk for venues and also like party organizers. There's been some like really incredible grassroots networks of like venue operators that I know like we're both a part of, and also other networks of like grassroots workers that are coming together to share information and just like share all of that peer intelligence that really exists. And some really incredible things have come out of that, including just things around like financial transparency, around fees. And I feel like the more information people share, the more people are equipped to kind of navigate all of these challenges that are happening. And yeah, I think I've just found a lot of like beauty in that lately amidst all of the challenges.
That leads beautifully on to the next question I was going to ask, which is what the rest of the industry can do. I don't know if there's anyone here who is an artist or a manager or a booker, people working elsewhere in the music industry. Are there things that they can do that maybe they're not doing at the moment that could benefit the rest of the ecosystem? I see Lenny is picking up the mic very quickly.
I'm ready.
There.
Yeah, I have to talk about PRS tonight. PRS, for anyone who doesn't know, is a rights management organization that represents songwriters, and they collect songwriter royalties and redistribute them to people so that when their works are performed, they get paid for it, which is a fair principle that no one serious is disputing. But PRS collect money from grassroots music venues for having artists perform, and they do it in a way which is incredibly problematic, which they've admitted 9 years ago is completely wrong. So there are basically like, I'm going to try and explain this very top level without getting too deep into it, but there are kind of two tariffs that you end up on with PRS. One assumes that every single artist that plays at your venue is a PRS member, and all of the songwriting royalties go to PRS for that gig. And the other one puts the burden of proving that that's not the case onto the venue, and they have to spend so much admin time on proving that to PRS that they don't really save any money anyway by proving that it wasn't a PRS artist. The reality is that maybe only like 30 or 40% of artists that play at your average small grassroots venue are PRS members. So PRS are collecting all of this money, and then to add insult to injury, their distribution systems are not working in a way that these small songwriters get that money back. So grassroots venues are paying huge sums of money to PRS, crippling amounts. PRS aren't actually giving it back to the songwriters who are performing in these venues. And then when venues try and say that they're being overcharged, or say that this system is wrong or doesn't work or refuse to pay, PRS just takes them to court and buries them in legal fees.
And just to jump in very quickly to give you all the sense of the amounts that we're talking about, there was a research study last year that looked specifically at electronic artists in the UK and estimated that £5.9 million per year was being wrongly allocated. So that's money that grassroots artists should be getting that is being sent elsewhere in the system rather than reaching the people that it should. Sorry to have interrupted, but...
No, very good point. So yeah, I would say to PRS, if they're in the room, if they're going to listen back to this, please, we need those tariffs to be reformed. We need something workable for grassroots venues, and we need songwriters who are playing these venues to actually be fairly paid and get that money. And if you're an artist or a promoter or just someone who loves music, and you want to learn more about this, Mark David, who's the CEO of Music Venue Trust, has written a 4-piece Substack on this, which goes into way more detail than I'm able to here. And I would just say, please talk about it so that we can put a bit of pressure on PRS to do the right thing, because they said they were going to sort it out 9 years ago, and we've all been waiting, and it's not happening.
Right, yeah.
One of my many industry gripes, but I'll stop.
Mike, other than PRS, are there other elements of the industry that you think could maybe step up in ways
specifically like the music industry? I guess like the relationship between artist, agent, and promoter, venue. Typically, an artist will have a fee in mind, and that fee fluctuates a bit depending on the show, but it doesn't really, for example, take into account so much the size of the venue. It's always a negotiation in these processes, but I just feel like shared risk models in the current climate is the way that, and I feel like agents should just be a lot more open and willing to work with a shared risk model, because it's just not sustainable to constantly have a series of promoters coming through and just always losing money, because it only means a certain type of person can be a promoter. And
just to clarify what a shared risk model would mean as a relative layperson here.
So, for example, you could, instead of agreeing a £500 fee for somebody, you could agree a £300 fee with a 10% share of profit. And you say our profit point is at 75% of the club full. And then, because generally speaking, like in events, like most people, or certainly people that I know that doing events, they're not building them to make profit, they're building them to break even. And so like a few small fluctuations, it can be the case of 10 or 20 tickets, can really make a big difference in those sort of scenarios.
The average profit margin for a grassroots UK music venue, according to the Music Venue Trust, is 1%. So on average, the entire physical infrastructure of grassroots music is operating within an accounting error's worth of going bust.
And that's up from 0.5% on the last year's report.
That's an improvement. That's something to celebrate, which sort of shows you where we are. Angeli, any thoughts on the responsibilities or opportunities for the rest of the music industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just back what both of you were saying about shouting about the issues at hand, and also in terms of, because one of the groups you mentioned was artists as well and what artists can do. I would also just back that artists are also workers, and kind of getting involved in worker organizing, again, talking about financial transparencies and fees, including with venues and promoters more openly, as well as with each other, I think can really strengthen the wider workforce as well. Because a lot of people work quite independently, work in silos, and I think that just causes a lot of issues around where money is actually being funneled to, whether it's PRS, which sounds like a lot, or kind of elsewhere, or an exploitative employer. Yeah,
I can't remember the exact date, but DJs were admitted to the musicians' union surprisingly late, well after the millennium. We've spoken quite a lot about the challenges, and to avoid getting too gloomy or catastrophic, I wanted to ask, what should the nightlife industry look like in 5 years' time, and what structural changes do we need to get there? If you could wave a magic wand 5 years into the future, what would you ideally like to see? Lenny, let's start with you.
More community-owned venues, no VAT on tickets for all cultural events, business rates exemptions for all independently owned venues, and just more funding, just core government funding so that people can take creative risks.
Short and to the point. I love it. Great. Anjali.
Yeah, definitely more community-owned venues. Also more worker-owned businesses, more worker cooperatives, like Pie House is a co-op, and I think Sister Midnight is as well. Yeah, so I think more of what you're doing, basically, I think would be amazing. And also more worker organizing. Again, nightlife is like a really ununionized sector. And when I did research for my book, I collected a lot of worker testimonies and stories. And there was just a lot of workers who were falling through the gaps, who were incredibly exploited, having a really hard time falling through the gaps of the existing kind of worker support or union networks. Including a couple months ago, I was attending a panel on queer nightlife, and there was a member of the nightlife task force on the panel who just kind of blanket said, we can't unionize as nightlife workers. And as someone involved in union organizing and knowing a lot of that work on the ground, that was really disheartening to hear, but also I think really signifies a big misunderstanding of our work in nightlife and what we do. And there's like plenty of examples. Musicians Union didn't include DJs for a long time, but Equity is doing a lot of incredible work around DJ unionizing. You know, there's like Unite for hospitality workers, Bec2 for technicians, IWGB for like cleaners and other gig economy workers. So I guess unionize.
And Mike, if you could have one wish granted for the next 5 years,
I don't think there's one. But I don't know, I guess like, you know, having proper stakeholders and like, you know, being able for people to get long leases, whether that's like with negotiations with landlords or like actually being able to, you know, not just be, you know, to actually put proper roots and have long-lasting infrastructure would be really key. And again, you know, like maybe for the government to recognise the importance of the sector and reflect that in, VAT kickbacks and all kinds of other schemes that you see in other industries like film and things like that, to kind of really try and actually say, well, this is one of, you know, the UK's biggest, you know, cultural exports, even if it's diluted through other means. This is where a lot of this stuff is developed. And I mean, that's enough for now.
You raise a great point about sort of institutions, local authorities, funders, central government. It feels to me like over the last few years there has been more engagement from those kind of decision makers in the value of grassroots nightlife. Is there more that they could be doing? What could they be doing that would make a meaningful difference in the present?
I mean, I think from a local authority perspective, extending business rates relief would be a really great policy. At the moment, a lot of local authorities only give mandatory relief of like an 80% reduction in your business rates bill if you're a charity, which a lot of venues aren't because charities can't sell alcohol, so that gets confusing. But extending that out to like other types of not-for-profit organizations, I think would be so good. But at the same time, that then has to be funded by the local authority. And so many local councils are just so stretched for budget. So I think a lot of it comes back to needing more funding for these kind of measures from central government.
It's always cash that ends up being the bottleneck here. Anjali, did you have any thoughts on the role of local authorities?
I was going to speak more to funding than local authorities, but yeah, I think over the past few years with this renewed interest in nightlife, and I do a lot of work around queer nightlife as well, specifically, there's been way more visibility than there might have been, especially in institutions and cultural institutions than before, which on the one hand can be good, but I think there's also a bit of a double-edged sword because often what I'm seeing how these partnerships or relationships often work is that they're kind of like one-off funding to do a night, and They can be a little bit extractive in terms of like you might get a lot of visibility and the institution might get to like report great diversity in terms of their audiences if they've booked like a queer POC for one night. But after that one night, a lot of the people who are putting on these events kind of go back to being pretty precarious workers bumping around venues. And so I think there's a real difference between like one-off, like short-term investments and thinking about how you actually sustain these scenes on a longer term basis and what these institutions or organizations with money and resource, how they can actually contribute to community wealth building rather than just kind of like momentary visibility. So I'm thinking more just like infrastructural support. I mean, we were talking earlier about like spaces opening up. Did that go off? Oh no, back. To use equipment, or again, we spoke about like core funding for organizations, you know, like unrestricted funding where it's not just like, oh, you have to deliver this project in a time frame. It's like, this is money where you actually have a say over what you want to do with it. And on top of that, I guess in terms of like local authorities, my job while I was writing this book about nightlife was actually in citizens' assemblies. So I was working on a citizens' assembly in the west of England, which, if anyone hasn't heard of them, it's just kind of a way of making policy decisions that puts power back into the hands of people. Anyone can make those decisions, basically, rather than decision makers or policy makers. And I think there's a lot of power in people making decisions for themselves. So I think I'd like to see a lot more distributed decision making happening, hopefully. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Mike, any final thoughts on the role of kind of external decision makers?
Well, I guess in relation to councils, you know, they're kind of the gatekeepers to licensing and things like that. So making things more like actually just the process more accessible and open would be a really good thing. And also the actual councillors and people in there actually somehow having more knowledge about actually what, you know, venues are and third spaces, you know, like they're very much quite blinkered to their understanding of what a modern venue might actually do. And then I guess also protection, so making it easier to start venues, and then existing venues trying to provide protections in terms of like not just allowing housing to be built really close to it, and all these other things that, you know, the sort of safeguarding that a council should really be doing to protect its assets in its area, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually just picking up on something you said earlier about like being able to lay down roots and like have spaces long term as well. Something that the local councils can do is community asset transfers. Like it doesn't cost them very much to transfer a building into the ownership of the community, and it just gives that reassurance that we're going to have spaces that we can collectively build for the long term. And I think that's such an important part of it as well.
Yeah, completely agree. Mike, your point about councillors maybe not necessarily understanding the intricacies of nightlife. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this, but what's one thing that people outside the nightlife industry don't know that you would like them to know?
I mean, I feel like we've kind of already covered it, but I think just like how much we rely on the bar spend, how much that means. And then I guess the other thing would be like understanding how restrictive licenses can be and how licensing law works. Because like none of us got into this lane of work to stop people from having a good time. It's like the opposite of what we're trying to do. But sometimes the requirements that you have in licensing are just such a huge burden that you have to fulfill. It's a legal requirement. And I think it can sometimes just, it's counterproductive to a lot of times to people having a good time, but I think it can make venue owners look kind of mean. And it's not our fault.
Yeah, I would also just say, again, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, but like the real breadth of the like worker ecosystem. Again, when we talk about nightlife workers, it's not just DJs, it's not just even promoters or venue operators. There's like so many different roles that really make up a night out. And a lot of these roles are really, really invisibilized. And I think they ought to be made more visible and talked about a lot more. And again, I was just thinking about my list of unions that I was talking about earlier. And I just also wanted to add that like welfare workers are also like a really important part of a night out. And there is, as far as I know, there's also like a burgeoning welfare union. So again, there's so many roles that are more behind the scenes that are like really crucial and essential to us having fun on a dance floor, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. And Mike?
I guess maybe just the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes, like you might have a 5 or 6, a 6-hour event on a Friday or Saturday, but there's continual hours of work that are going in the week to kind of, all of the conversations around the technical requirements of artists, just the actual booking, the cleaning, the maintenance, there's like a huge amount, a wealth of like hours that are spent just for that one 6-hour event to happen. I think maybe is something that maybe a lot of people don't realize happens behind the scenes.
I wanted to ask a little bit about where you see our current moment in relation to the kind of immediate past. There's been a lot of changes in how nightlife is talked about, how it's governed. Have there been kind of positives over the last few years, in addition to all the challenges that we've discussed? Do you see the trajectory continuing to be positive in certain ways? Are you optimistic about the future, as well as being, aware of the challenges, potentially a little pessimistic? Is there reason for hope at the moment?
Yeah, gotcha. There's some really amazing things happening. I feel like we've seen so many more community-owned and worker-owned spaces popping up, which I just think is so great. We've seen since the pandemic, I think pre-pandemic, maybe like only 17% of grassroots venues in the UK had ever accessed public funding to support their work. Post-pandemic, that's now above 70%. So people have like learned this skill of how to apply for funding and get that into their work, which is just incredible. Music Venue Trust are doing incredible things. Like I've already highlighted the Grassroots Levy, and that funding's starting to come through now, which is amazing. But they also launched Music Venue Properties, which is like a nationwide scheme where they are raising funds through a community shares model. So it's like a community-owned entity that is buying up the freeholds of existing venues and then leasing them back to the existing operators on more secure terms. So those spaces are now like protected in perpetuity, which is amazing. So I think there are really positive changes happening, and there's brilliant ideas out there, and we do just need a little bit more money to keep these ideas moving. But the change is coming. I feel really optimistic, to be honest.
Anjali, do you share Lenny's optimism?
Yeah, I also feel surprisingly optimistic. I know we've spoken about this, about like maybe this is a big year for clubbing, But yeah, I mean, along with all the amazing things you've listed, like, the reopening of the Friends of the Joiners Arms, opening of Sister Midnight, the opening of a lot of community-owned venues is really exciting. But also in the past couple of years, I think first through the pandemic, and then also with the Palestine Solidarity Movement and a lot of DJs boycotting major festivals, I think compared to when I first started in nightlife, people are having like real conversations and like taking action around corporate ownership of our spaces and festivals. And I think that's a really positive and exciting development. And again, I think a few years ago, those discussions weren't necessarily happening with the same urgency and the same kind of like velocity. And there's been a bunch of other exciting developments, like I'm going to plug Gel, which is a grassroots ticketing platform. I know a few of the people, Ben and others who started it, are here tonight. It's a grassroots ticketing and events listing platform, again, like an alternative to the ones that we tend to rely on. And so, yeah, people building actual like grassroots owned infrastructure, as well as like, is just, I think, a super exciting development. I think people actually like taking agency over the things that we rely on and being like, we can actually do this ourselves is really cool.
Mike, any causes for optimism from you?
No, definitely. I think there's loads of venues, new venues that have opened. There's new opportunities. I think, with the dropout in some of central London now, there's opportunities that might come up for spaces to move back into place. I think there's a lot of very positive things, but I would say that the facts that it feels like there's a lot more independent venues connected now than there was. And that can only just mean that things are going to, that we can support each other. And, for example, like the ticketing platform, or whether it's like taking control of like, other sort of areas of extractive wealth from the community and just trying to put those in our own hands, I think is actually like one of the key things that we should be trying to push for and are.
Amazing. I'm going to chuck one in as well. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but I just think crowds seem nicer at the moment. I definitely went through a few years of my own personal clubbing kind of history where didn't always feel entirely at home at dance floors, or it felt like the vibe had shifted slightly. Everyone seems really ecstatic to be out at the moment. That's just one thing that I've noticed in the last 12 to 24 months.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
Sorry. I know we've been talking a lot about like the formal nightlife sector, but I also just feel really hopeful and excited by the ongoing rave scene. I feel like people are throwing the best parties at the moment in the wildest locations. And I think there's a lot of overlap between the formal nightlife work scene, and a lot of people are running these more DIY events as well. But I think that's very much alive and thriving. I mean, one of my first gigs this year was in like a World War II bunker underneath Hampstead Heath. And so people are still doing that stuff. They're still kind of like breaking in and making these spaces. And again, going off on your point about dance floors feeling kinder and safer, you know, this was a squat rave that had like welfare staff and, you know, like water everywhere. And like you were really looked after, and food, and, you know, like all of that kind of stuff. So I feel like people are going the extra mile outside of the more formal nightlife scene as well.
That informal angle leads me on to another question that I really wanted to ask about each of your kind of starting points. What kind of inspired you to get started, either like organizing venues or running parties? And were there other venues or spaces or events that acted as a bit of a template, something that you want to emulate in the future? Maybe that might be a free party or a squat party or something outside of the traditional nightlife industry.
In terms of what got me started on all this, I was making a lot of art about the fact that I was really sad that we didn't have as many clubs as we used to. And the more that I like learn about how many venues had closed over the last like 20, 30 years in the UK, the angrier and more bitter I got. And then the venue that I was volunteering at told me that they were going to close. And I was just like, I can't take this, not another one. So I ended up just taking on the lease to that space and keeping it running. And that was like the first Sister Midnight. So yeah, I'm operating from a place of injustice.
I feel like when I first got started, I was also like, there's a, you know, long-standing current and like contemporary and also historical relationship between queer communities and nightlife. And I say this also because like in the research for my book, when I was reading about like queer histories and queer stories, even ones that had nothing to do with nightlife, the club always made an appearance. And it was just always has been this really important kind of community space for people to connect, for people to make art outside of institutions that might be more hostile towards them, and also to work and to make and find work for each other. So I think, you know, I first got involved in nightlife because I was really motivated by that kind of community aspect and how people were kind of supporting each other in a lot of ways, in many like material, but also emotional, spiritual ways in these spaces. And that kind of like drove me to want to participate in them a lot more actively by kind of like throwing nights like I do with friends. Again, Esme's here. I run a night called The List with Esme. But yeah, so I think it was kind of that like community aspect that really motivated me.
Okay. And Mike, were there any antecedents for Ormside that really inspired you?
Well, I guess like the driving force for me would be like this sort of just collective immersive experience, being the wanting to be around that, involved in it and facilitating it as the driving force behind it. And then everything else is kind of just making it happen, all the mechanics of it. And where that comes from, I don't know, but but that's where we are now.
I guess it's a sense of community, right?
Yeah, but I think it's also this sense of like, I think there's just this primal thing of, you know, like you can listen to music on your own, but there's something about experiencing intense music around others, but not necessarily, you don't necessarily need to be talking to those people, engaging with those people. It's like transformative or something. And I think that's what, and I think going back to how as the landscape has been shifting, I feel like maybe, and going back to your point about saying people in clubs are better or something, I don't know, like maybe it's that things are becoming more focused again as things become less commercially viable, maybe for that they focus more on what the core elements are that they are or something.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's a real sense of urgency for these spaces now, right? Like it's still a place to go out and like have fun and make memories, but I think we're all like really feeling how important these spaces are in like creating and like holding communities together, and it's just so desperately needed.
I wanted to, just for our final question before we open things up to the floor, I wanted to ask about that idea of community. It's a word that comes up very, very often in nightlife discussions and often means a million different things to a million different people. What does community mean to you, and how do you distinguish true grassroots community from community as a branding exercise? Anjali, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I feel like for me, again, communities is kind of like slippery, broad word that can be used and misused or used in so many different ways. But I think when I really think about it, I think it's about like ownership and like decision-making power. Like if you're in a space who's actually making decisions about what's happening in there, how it's run, are the people who animate the space, who bring it to life, actually involved in those decisions? And to me, that is more of a community space. So like venues that are community owned, that's a community space because people have actual decision-making power in those spaces. And also, I guess the same thing around ownership. Who's owning it and where is the money being funneled to? Is it going back into the community, or is it funneling up to, I don't know, PRS or somebody else? So for me, that's what distinguishes it. And I think, looking at kind of that, like where the wealth is going, where the power is really key to kind of picking apart our kind of overuse of this word community at the moment.
I'll always remember I was in a community space in Edinburgh called The Forest, and the guy behind the bar called time, and someone said, "Why?" I said, "Well, because I need to go home." And this person said, "Well, I'll do it." And so they trained him up to run the bar, gave him the keys, and the place got to stay open, which to me just feels like that's what we should be aiming for when we talk about community, the idea that anyone could just step up and help run it if they so chose.
That's so beautiful. I love that. Community is such a difficult word. I've been thinking about it a lot recently. I feel like it just has a lot of different meanings. And in my head, I feel like there's two very distinct sides to it for me. There's like the community, which like in itself, that's like a thing to explore, but it's like talking about a group or groups of people. But then there's also like community as a practice. And I think that's kind of what you were touching on. Like I see it as a practice of like solidarity and connection and sharing. And it's like a thing that you do actively rather than being about like just a certain group of people. Because I think people can hear the word community and like think that it's not for them, that they're not part of it. It can be quite an othering term. And so I'm kind of like trying to reframe the way that I use it to be that more active sense of the word.
Emma Warren, an author who I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, likes using the term musicking to talk about being involved in music. Maybe we should turn community from a noun to a verb and think about communitying as well. Mike, what would communitying look like at Ormside? How would you interpret that?
Well, okay. Well, one thing, I mean, say for example, you come to the door. I'll talk about it as more a general venue rather than Ormside, but you come to the door person may have played at the venue the night before. You enter the space, there's people that you may know, you may not know, but everyone there is funding through their door entry and their sales at the bar. They're contributing towards sustaining this thing, but they're also like decision makers in it because they hadn't bought those tickets. There's kind of like some sort of, there's different layers of like the input the community have to these things. And how these sort of things are shaped. Because I guess one thing I was thinking about just now when we're talking is the difference between when we say like a scene and a community. Like what does that look like? So we might say like the London art scene, but we don't like say the London art community. But we talk about grassroots London music communities around spaces. And I think that is down to a financial thing because it's bottom up rather than top down. Maybe is, I don't know, more thought on that. I'm not sure.
The community creates itself.
Exactly.
The scene is created by others.
Yeah.
I feel like that's an interesting place to pause things. Is there anyone in the audience? I believe we've got a couple of roving mics. Is there anyone in the audience who might have a couple of questions for the panel? Please. It's quite difficult to see, but if you raise your hands. Oh, we've got house lights. Brilliant. Oh, we've got a gentleman at the back there, I believe.
Hello. Oh, hi. Yeah. Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. I just want to ask Ed you a question. I know you've spoken about the way that negative press around dance music and nightlife has the actual effect of kind of accelerating or contributing to that sort of sense of decline. And I was wondering what you might think of as a sort of a counter to that. Do we need our own sort of positive fake it till you make it sort of spin, or how do we confront that?
I think it's less about faking it until you make it and celebrating the fact that regardless of all the challenges that we've heard about and that I think we're all broadly aware of if we follow news around grassroots nightlife, it's celebrating the fact that despite all of that, people are still doing incredible things against the odds in many circumstances or creating kind of new odds for themselves. And there's so much exciting, vital, positive stuff happening, and focusing on and celebrating that rather than reacting negatively, I think it's not about pretending that those problems aren't there. It's about being realistic about the balance between them and the fact that exceptional stuff continues to happen despite them. Does anyone else have any questions? Well, lady down the front here.
Thank you all very much. Kind of related to some threads that have been woven through the discussion. My question is that nightlife, grassroots or otherwise, I think has a certain reputation in wider society. And for lots of people, it's an unknown thing and it's therefore a bit scary and it's dark and etc. And therefore kind of something to be like minimized or controlled. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we have to fight so hard for like more mainstream funding. People associate it with like illegal things and dangerous things and, it being kind of hedonism rather than for lots of people like a real necessity or a safe space or etc. Do you think it would help to try and shift that narrative? And if so, do you have ideas about how we might do that?
Angeli, I feel like Club Commons deals with some of those questions, so maybe you'd be the best person to answer that.
I might have a
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely important that we shift that narrative, but I think the only way that we can do that is by inviting people in. And as you've kind of highlighted, it can be sometimes quite hard to get someone over that barrier when they've got a certain image of their mind. I think there's a lot of really great grassroots operators who are doing a really good job at like talking about nightlife in different terms, and like we're getting more of a platform for that now, and that is great. But I also think that just having more spaces in people's local areas so they can see what's happening in real proximity, it kind of like forces you, I guess, into a bit more of a conversation about it, even if that conversation is just like, last night the music was really loud and it kept me up until 2 a.m. and my baby was screaming and that was really annoying. Like just forcing those kind of interactions and getting people to know what's going on in their local area, I think will start to build the relationships a bit better. So it's a hard job, and I don't know how you like encourage someone to come into a space when they're like hesitant, but there are ways that people are doing it by creating, a variety of different kind of events that people can come to, and like music venues are starting to open up more in the day, and that kind of changes the perception of them being just these nighttime only spaces for hedonism and danger. Like they're cafes now as well and co-working spaces, and I think that's starting to break down those barriers a little bit.
Saunas.
Yeah, I would also back bringing people into the night, but I think I will also just like share a really quick story from my book club Commons. I spoke to someone who was running a Black lesbian sound system called Systematic, and they started in the mid-1980s, and they're still throwing parties today. But in the mid-1980s, they used to run parties at the South London Women's Centre, so not really in commercial clubs, but in like kind of community centres. Again, those are kind of a lot harder to access today. And alongside their parties, which would be from like 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., they would also have like a creche so that like women could bring their babies to be looked after by qualified childcare workers in a soundproof room. And I just think that's like such an act of care, like collective care, that really challenges all these ideas of nightlife being like dangerous and seedy. And again, this was happening in the 80s. This stuff isn't new at all. So I wonder how new this narrative is. And I think also, again, talking about that close relationship between queer communities in nightlife, I think it's really dangerous to often make these assumptions that that this is like inherently seedy. And I think there's a much more of a historical background to that perspective on nightlife. There's also like a flip side that I feel like I haven't like fully articulated in my head, but maybe I'll try and like get it out. But there's also like, I don't think necessarily we need or should be striving to like over sanitize our nightlife spaces. I think maybe some of them are a little bit grubby. Maybe some of them are a little bit seedy. Maybe we love them for that. And like, I'm not advocating for dangerous nightlife at all. I think there's a lot to be said about how we improve like our safety on a night out. But I don't know, there's something there that I haven't quite like a thought that I haven't formed in my head in response to your answer. That's something about not being hesitant, a little bit hesitant to over sanitize, being like, we're all bright in the daylight. Look at everything that we do. We're clean, you know, like good members of society. Maybe we need to challenge what a good member of society is.
It's not just that nightlife has to prove itself as culture. It's that we need to expand our understandings of culture to include things that are grubby or seedy.
Yes, thank you for articulating so neatly what was in my mind.
Mike, any thoughts in response to the question?
Yeah, I guess like just having a full spectrum of all types of different spaces is obviously the answer to this. It's like, having spaces that do, convey things that maybe licensing authorities think are negative, like these spaces are important. And, as long as they're being run well by good faith operators, I think like they should exist. And, and they should be protected as well. But the thing is that just having that whole spectrum of different spaces, I think, is just the key, and the more of them, the more specialist.
The other thing I wanted to mention in relation to parenthood and raving, I went to a sober daytime rave recently called Club Soft. I know there's at least one person who's a resident DJ there in the audience. And Mina, the founder, because it's a sober party, because it's a daytime party, got her mum and dad to do the door, which is just a beautiful little like way to bring people who might normally not feel welcome in a club space. So I think as we are forced to reckon with the threats facing traditional forms of nightlife, imagine other opportunities, other pathways for it that inherently opens things up and creates perhaps some of these connections to forms of culture that might not necessarily have been obvious even a few years ago. Any other questions from the audience?
Can I add one more quick thing on that? Yeah, and just again to go back, when I started looking into like nightlife scenes from like 40, 50 years ago, again, a lot of these things, these like new intergenerational spaces, they're not new at all. And that's not to say that they're wrong. I think it's amazing, but I think there's a renewed interest in these kind of like intergenerational, more caring club spaces that I think is like especially exciting and hopeful. So yeah.
We had a couple of questions in the middle here.
Hi, thank you. I've had a very interesting evening so far. I was just wondering, what do you think the role of the minimum bar spend should be in the relationship between a promoter and a venue?
Hey, Mike, yeah, you might be the...
We don't have a minimum bar spend at Ormside, just to say, like, we sort of structure our rental model where we actually give money back off the rent as it goes past a certain point, which I think is a better way of doing it. And, we've been running for 10 years, so it's worked. Like, so that's my opinion on minimum bar spends. I think it's a bad thing. So yeah.
Lenny, will Sister Midnight be operating a minimum bar spend when you open?
I don't know. We haven't talked about it yet. I'm still trying to figure out how we fix the roof. I would say that I agree it's like not conducive to like creating an environment where people can take risks and grow and learn and fail sometimes, but the way that a venue's finances are balanced is so that they're not doing that because they want to make it the case that everyone has to come and run a completely successful night and there's no room for failure because they think that failure is bad. It's because like one bad night is the difference between them being able to pay their staff or pay their rent or not. And so I'm just going to bring it back to money again. If venues had more funding, they would be able to take more risks. They would be able to create the conditions for people to come in and try things. And I think every like good grassroots operator actually wants to do that. It's just that we're so limited by the current conditions.
There's a question in the middle there as well.
Hi, Daniel from Happening. I think well, it's been really interesting hearing the sort of picture that you've painted about the sort of fragile and intricate relationships that all of us who work in venues have to sort of tend and take care of, like, on a daily basis. But the relationship we haven't really talked about yet is between grassroots venues and all the other venues, whatever the kind of opposite term is for everything else. And I'm wondering if on the panel you can talk about your experiences of that relationship. I'm thinking about Fabric, for example, or sort of large, long-standing, successful venues and organizations. What your experiences are of that relationship, whether you think there's more that can be made of it, and also, I guess, whether you think there's a responsibility for some of those venues to support grassroots venues, because grassroots venues often become feeder venues further down the line.
Who'd like to go first on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of feels like those larger venues above a grassroots level are just in a different world sometimes. It feels like that is another industry that we just don't even really have a relationship with. But I think I touched on the grassroots levy earlier, and I think that's a really important way that we can kind of build a relationship and build a more explicit understanding that the kind of artists that we are helping to develop in grassroots venues are the people that end up playing massive stadium shows, and there needs to be more of a relationship between the two. So I think that's the answer for me. Like, we have some people in the industry who own a lot of the infrastructure and who are making a lot of profit off of that, and they should start paying it back.
And just to go into the grassroots levy, I don't know if anyone else has seen, but some more details of exactly how that's going to function coming through, and they're really interesting. So one of the things that Liveline, which is the recipient of that levy money, is doing, they've set up basically an insurance program for promoters and in-house promoters in venues, where if you want to run a tour or a show, you can apply to Liveline, and they will guarantee 80% of any losses. So if you don't make your money back, 80% of that will be covered by the fund. If you break even or make a profit, you keep all of that. So it's essentially sort of keeping that money in reserve, using it to provide a sort of a safety net for people to take the sort of risks that you're talking about.
Yeah, I was also going to bring up the music levy, but also I think, like, again, the more that, grassroots networks do stuff like this and kind of like cultivate a collective voice, hopefully that can put enough pressure on these bigger venues. Again, because I agree, it feels kind of like they're in a separate league of their own almost. But I think the more that these networks are cultivated between venues and also between workers, maybe more initiatives like the Music Levy Fund could kind of like develop in order to kind of redistribute some of that resource hoarding and also power hoarding and kind of infrastructure to kind of more grassroots scenes.
Mike, any thoughts on the relationship with larger venues?
Yeah, I guess like I can think of examples where we've had maybe an artist that may have played Drumshed and, say that's 100 times bigger than our venue, right? So it's like, if you imagine, or if there's a lineup, for example, at like a big venue like that with crossover with a night like ours, it's like, even if like 0.1% of audiences are drawn to that, that's half our venue. Do you see what I mean? It's so just the scale of operation between having a small venue and a large one, and how that even reflects to fees. Like, I don't know. I don't think the artist is being paid 100 times more than what we would pay them. Like, and so there's these factors of what, and to draw it back to, for example, the PRS thing we were talking about earlier. Do you think, if you do a live gig in London, you're supposed to pay 4.2% of the turnover of that event, not the profit, to PRS? Do you think, Apple Music pay 4% of their turnover to PRS on music plays, or Spotify? They don't pay anything near that. They pay a 0 point something of a percent. So I think like this is one of the key things, which is the only way these large operators are able to operate is because they don't operate on the same rules as a smaller venue, because they're able to negotiate these like really cutthroat deals with so that's one of the key things. And that's why, like, going back to what we're talking about, it's all about smaller venues linking up to try and take those on.
I'd completely agree. I would add one more thing, just as a music journalist, the narrative around nightlife spaces, I think, has evolved a lot in the last 5-10 years. But I do think there's more that people who talk about nightlife publicly could do to distinguish between large commercially owned, commercially operated spaces and grassroots spaces. So to put more of a category distinction between those two models of operating, and to celebrate grassroots spaces far more than corporate ones. I appreciate there are knotty financial obligations involved in all of this, but yeah, I do think there's more me and people like me could do to make that distinction in the discourse. Do we have any other questions? Oh, yeah, we've got one in the middle here.
I wanted to ask a question about, you kind of talked about how, sorry, it's so scary when so many people are looking at you. Why do you kind of talked about earlier about how it feels like music and artists are like more important now to the scene, like a little bit. It was touched on the way kind of like events and promoters now, people don't have the money to go out, you said, Lenny, like on a whim, and kind of why that has changed, and like why the music and artists are kind of so much more part of like how venues operate and promoters are putting out events, like the residency that Phonox does, for instance, like 4 Fridays at Phonox for like certain artists, and that's like we just booked the Deep Medi one in like June, like that's ages away, but that's obviously fine. But like just wondering why that kind of change has happened within the last, like it does feel like since the pandemic. And also thank you for mentioning Bussy, because like RIP big time.
I know, so sad, I miss it, I want it back. I think that it feels like there's more solidarity now between like artists, promoters, venues, labels, like working at a grassroots level, because it is just so tough for everyone. And I feel like especially in the pandemic, like we all had a lot of time just to sit and think about it, and the venues weren't there, and we all really felt the lack of those kind of spaces in our lives. And so I think as we've come back out of that, people have been a lot more willing to talk about the issues, because, you know, in the pandemic, before we had cultural recovery funding, before the government was doing furlough schemes and stuff, venues were just having to put out crowdfunders and say, you know, we've just been told by the government that we have to shut, but we've got no way to pay our bills or to pay our staff. So we had to suddenly get really transparent about what the realities were. And I think that's like a little bit of a mindset shift that has persisted after the pandemic, which is so great. And now, you know, things are getting even tougher. Cost of living, like rents going up for venues, everything's getting harder. And out of necessity, people are having to work together more to keep these spaces open. And so I think there's a recognition now that we're all invested in them. We're all part of an ecosystem. If the venues go, the artists don't have jobs. If the artists go, the venues don't have anyone to come and play there. Like, you know, it's all interconnected. And so I think there's just a big feeling of wanting to pull together and make it work as best we can right now.
Angela or Mike, any thoughts? I was just going to add, historically, in terms of the place that dance music is occupied within the overall kind of UK cultural ecosystem. 20 years ago, like going out dancing in a club was what you did. It was the primary site for kind of youth culture and youth social interaction. I feel like that role has sort of been superseded by social media in the last 10 to 20 years. So going out to a club is no longer the default in the way that it was a generation ago, and that has all sorts of economic knock-on effects. I'd say that people engaging with club culture and dance music now do so with slightly more intentionality, and that I think is why you see, you know, events being announced so far in advance. In addition to the economic pressures on venues to get ticket sales in early so that they can guarantee those events go ahead. But yeah, people are more actively engaged with how they consume this culture, rather than it being something that you sort of do almost by accident while you're trying to do something else, if that makes sense.
Maybe just to add on that really quickly, sorry. Also, again, when I was... Did I turn it off? Oh, it's back on. When I was speaking to people running nights, again, like before I was born, there was a much broader range of spaces available to run nights that were not necessarily commercial clubs. So again, most of the people, when they were running queer, like grassroots queer nights in the 80s and 90s, were doing in squats before residential squatting was illegal. and also in community centers that were actually set up to run nights. So again, I think that's like another real big difference between then and now. Most of the spaces we have now to throw these kind of events are commercial venues, which I think does kind of change the focus and emphasis on a night in some ways.
Thank you. Maybe one more question. Any other questions? Okay, so we've got maybe just these. So this gentleman at the front, the woman in the middle, and then, yeah.
Hi. I'm interested in, these grassroots venues, and they have this curatorial control, right? And I'm wondering, like, how you balance, like, having a sort of consistent artistic program you feel like aligns with your vision for the club, and then taking on nights that potentially are a bit lame but make loads of money. Because I know that with like Fold, for example, like you'll go sometimes and it's not a good party, but like obviously there's lots of people there. So I'm wondering like how you balance that.
The eternal question of how much you decide to sell out.
RA's recent article on Corsica's history gives you a really great example as to how they dealt with those sorts of challenges, and they accepted that you needed to take hits on some nights and bring in money on others. I think just exploring that article will shed a lot of light on that, but these guys can definitely tell you a lot more. But it's been done.
I mean, yeah, I would just add, when I was a club programmer a few years ago, so doing the booking, we would just need to take every now and then a night that kind of sucked, but that would bring in loads and loads of money, but that would kind of set us up for the rest of the month. And what it meant was that we could run like I work with a collective called Misery that runs like sober club nights for queer people of color, and taking that one night meant that we could take like a massive loss on the next one in order to like support these other kinds of nights. So I don't know if it's good or bad, but it did enable us like to program actually the stuff that we really wanted to program, and we would just kind of like all brace ourselves for those really boring nights. We're like, we're gonna get through this is our like token moneymaker. Let's just do it. Tomorrow's gonna be another good one. So yeah, I don't know if it's really an answer, just apart from, that's what we would do.
Like, what's the most boring night you've run?
So I guess like it's. Sorry, say that again.
I just asked what's the most boring night you've run, and was it worth it?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's boring to me, but someone else would have got a lot from it. This is the thing. So it's like, and this is I think an important thing, which is like having like not just being a home to one thing, I think is like a key to a good venue. Having lots of people that all actually call it their home is super important. And I think balancing the program in terms of like when, proposals come through for things or there's opportunities that come along, certain things you just know are going to be complete sellouts from the start and they're going to be oversubscribed. They're too big to be happening in the venue. And then there's a lot of things that really, when they come in, you're sort of like, you've got the best intentions and hope they'll do well, but sometimes they don't work out. And the discrepancy between, it'd be great to be 75% full every night of the week, but the discrepancy between like having oversubscribed shows and then shows at like 25% capacity, and it's just trying to get a balance between, it's just risk management essentially of what things are, and then judging of like, maybe it's not going to make money, but is this a value to said community, to other things? Should we take a risk on this and see how this goes? And I think just the sort of conversations that venues are just having all the time when looking at their program. And the more money that was there, the more risks that could be taken and so on.
I would also just add one thing. When I was speaking to people for my book, I was speaking to queer nightlife promoters, and actually something that did come up a lot in terms of like, as a programmer or booker, like balancing money-making nights and more community-oriented nights, is that often both in the past and now, a lot of like queer nights would face a lot of barriers in terms of getting like a Friday or Saturday night, because programmers might assume or make the assumption that they're not going to make enough money. And it's kind of hard to tell if that assumption is based on, I don't know, reality and like experience of the venue, or kind of just other assumptions about a particular community or night. So I think it's like a fine line to balance there. And sometimes it can go really well in terms of booking one night so you can book that community night. But I do think from the conversations I've had, some people in those decision-making roles might, have hidden behind kind of financial incentive just to kind of not really book a really great night.
We had one more question just here, and then I think we will need to wrap up.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences, all super interesting. It might be a bit of a basic question. I know you mentioned the app, but I was wondering, how would you suggest audiences can become more familiar with like new grassroots venues and like new events?
How do people become more familiar with new grassroots music venues and new events? Well, there's this great one opening in Lewisham called Sister Midnight, which you should definitely check out.
I was also say, again, go on to Gel platform run by Ben, who's just in the front, and a crew of others. It's an events listing platform. And so there's so many incredible events on there and venues that just like week by week are running.
I mean, we need to really break the Instagram like as the main platform, because that is how I find out about most things. And it's problematic because it's not a platform that we have any control over. And so the importance of things like Gel and joining mailing lists and things like that, and trying to break away from, large corporate America, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I really back this. For our party that I run with Esme, we rely on mailing lists and WhatsApp to promote the night. And actually moving away from Instagram has been so beneficial for our night. Once we started doing that, actually the night's like sold out. Once we got off Instagram, I mean, we were never on Instagram, but once we like made an intentional decision not to like rely on Instagram to promote, because then the people who engaged were there was a signing up to a mailing list is slightly more like active than just scrolling on Instagram. So the people who would actually take the effort to sign up were very likely to come. So it made a huge difference to our night. So I hard back mailing lists.
And I think it's a responsibility on all of us as music lovers to remain open to new things. Like I'm far less good at this than I should be, but just like going to venues and trying them out in person, even if it's not necessarily something that is going to be great, giving it a risk, and you might uncover something amazing in some small little space around the corner from you that you'd never looked at twice, and you try it and it's actually incredible. I think we're probably going to need to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. I have a couple of thank yous to run through. Firstly, to our wonderful panelists, to KINDRED, to Fabric and the London Museum. Thank you to a number of people who played a vital role in putting tonight's event together. Iona Thomas, Yushi, John Kay, DJ Ojo, Joe Koch, and the whole team at Gut Level. This event's also been supported by the City of London Corporation's Community Infrastructure Levy Neighbourhood Fund and by Arts Council England. So a big thank you to both of those organisations too. And I wanted to let you know about a series of events that KINDRED and London Museum are running over the course of May and June. They're going to be hosting free workshops for 18 to 13-year-olds on music journalism, photographing nightlife, club promotion and label management. You can book free tickets for those directly through the London Museum website. Thank you all again. Please give our panelists a round of applause. We have the room until 9 o'clock, so please stay for a drink. Thank you.